Okay, welcome everybody to the second and final, sad to say, meeting of our Grounded Book Club for this season of HD Live in Schools. We are thrilled to be joined by the one and only George Brant, the playwright and librettist of Grounded. And before we talk about his career and his work on the opera and future operas, which we heard about last week with Paul Cremo, and maybe we'll get more of a teaser about what that's all about. George is, of course, the playwright and librettist for Grounded, but he's also written a number of other plays, including Marie and Rosetta, Into the Breaches, The Prince of Providence, Tender Age, The Mourner's Bench, and Elephant's Graveyard. His scripts have been translated into 17 languages and performed internationally by such companies as the Public Theater, where Grounded appeared about a decade ago, as well as Atlantic Theater Company, Studio Theater, Gate Theater, Page 73, and the Edinburgh Traverse Theater. And he has received a Lucille Lortel Award, the Smith Prize, the Scotsman Fringe First Award, and the Keene Prize for Literature. I'm sure there are many others that we don't have time to list at this moment. So thank you so much, George, for being here.
Of course, it's a pleasure.
So my first question is very broad on purpose. And it's, how did you become a playwright? Because if I'm not incorrect, and maybe I am, you started as an actor or studied acting as a young person and then moved into playwriting later. So I'm curious about what that transition was like.
Sure, yeah. Definitely did start out thinking I would be an actor. Went to Northwestern University for acting. And while I was there, I did start to do some more serious writing, although it was pretty inserious writing. It was an adaptation of King Kong for the stage that I worked on with a friend of mine, JP. And that kind of started some writing. And then we had an improv troupe there that also wrote, did some sketch writing there. And after graduating, moved into Chicago and started out pretty exclusively trying to get acting gigs. But then over time, I found that I wasn't getting the parts that I wanted. And so I thought, well, why don't I just write them for myself? So that was kind of the beginning of things. I looked for the cheapest venue that I could rent in Chicago and wrote a nice little short 1-hour play that would fit their and their time schedule. And then kind of went from there. And then, so when I started out, I was really just writing for myself, and usually was, handling the postering and, sound design and everything for these productions. And then over time, kind of accumulated a troupe of actors who wanted to do the plays, and that kind of eased me out of the acting seat there and kind of exclusively into the writing one. And I also met my wife, Laura Kepley, and she's a much better director than I am. So she became the director for our troupe. And yeah, we carried on in that way for a while. And then over that time, I kind of did make that transition in general. I haven't acted in a long time now. I kind of miss it, but I guess I'm a writer now.
You're stuck being a writer.
Yeah.
You're at the point of no return. I'm curious, when you say you were writing parts that you wanted to play, were these one-person shows or one-man shows, and what kinds of roles were you writing that you wanted to play? What is that?
Yeah.
What was the desired role?
Right. I think probably greatly because I was living in Chicago, which is a big comedy town with Second City there, and then that's the biggest improv troupe, but there's like 4 or 5 others.
Right.
So there's a lot of comedy in the air. And I think that was partly why I was focusing on that in the beginning. So mostly I was writing there were a lot of satires of musicals, satires of musicals that didn't exist yet. And I wasn't so much writing. I mean, the first thing I wrote was for 3 people, so it wasn't just for myself. It was a parody of Love Letters, the play that all it requires is basically two music stands and two actors to read the letters back and forth. So that struck me as fertile ground for comedy. So wrote lovely letters, which was one of the first things that I did. And then over time, kind of just about right before I left Chicago, I kind of started to explore a more serious bent and started to think about so much of what I was writing were satires of existing things or making fun of theater in general. And I kind of hit a point where I felt like I couldn't keep, theater has a hard enough time. And I was like, why do I keep making fun of it? Maybe I need to figure out what I would like to say and not just work in other people's forms. So that kind of led to whatever next phase of my career that was.
I'll admit to being a little surprised that you were focused so much on satire.
Yes.
Although I did have the experience, and I wonder if you did too, of seeing Grounded at the opera and having quite a few laughs. And I myself was surprised by the funny moments, which go hand in hand with the dramatic moments. So I wonder if there's some of that, a sort of some relic of that old satirist practice you had, or
yeah, I think so.
There's still a funny element in Grounded.
Right.
That's surprising.
Yeah, I mean, it's there in the play as well. I think that kind of a sometimes very dark, comic spirit lurking in there. I mean, the pilot, it just like she has a sense of humor, and tries to keep it. And I think in that way you do when you're, she's sitting alone in this trailer for 12 hours a day and your mind wanders. And part of what she does is, make jokes for herself. And I think in general, I do kind of feel like a laugh is one of the best ways to work through an audience's defenses. I think if you can make them laugh, it's almost involuntary bodily response, and it opens you up, I think. And especially, I will say, I was especially proud that this was getting laughs in the Opera House because I wasn't sure if I think people sometimes don't realize that, oh, this is a serious opera, I can't laugh, and it takes you a little while to get over that hump with them to before they realize, oh no, that was a joke and I can laugh. But I do think that, once you've kind of opened an audience member up, I think that even allows the tragic parts of it to land even more soundly. So it is kind of part of an overall strategy, I suppose, in that way. But I do think there's that variety. Like, again, if you could get a laugh in an opera house, it just is that kind of feeling like, oh, this could go anywhere. Like, I think it keeps you listening in a different way as an audience member, if you know that's a possibility that oh, maybe I need to be waiting or looking for the punchline here.
Yeah, and it also has a way of exaggerating or amplifying the comedic effect. And I think of lines in the opera like "Viva Las Vegas,"
right,
which when you say it, it can be funny, but
it can
in an
be
opera,
whatever.
phrase,
right,
"Viva Las Vegas" is almost nobody's ever heard that phrase in an opera before.
No, and the way Janine wrote the music,
the Cinnabon song.
Yes.
The opera just makes it actually all the more funnier because it seems to be so incongruent with the form, but it works.
Yes. Yeah, I'd say the Cinnabon line was probably the most direct line from my earlier work. And that was really prompted by Janine. She really got excited by the shopping mall idea and what might happen there, and really wanted this moment with the chorus and wanted something a little lighter to start the second act. So that people came back and they were, not plunged immediately into Jess's troubled mind.
So how does Grounded come about? You've talked about, this move to playwriting, this move from satire to more serious topics. At what point in your trajectory does this idea appear? And does it start with the idea for I think I want to do a one-woman show?
Mhm.
Or does it start with finding a topic and then asking what kind of structure, what kind of form works for this thing that you happened upon?
Yeah, a little bit of both. There was I had an interest in drones, and at
Mhm.
the time they were top secret, and I wanted to know more about them. Um, and part of my mind is always like, oh, could this be a play?
Mhm.
In the back of my head. But I was just in general interested in them. Um, and and then when I found out about the pilots and what they go through and the challenges that they face with having one of the first warriors who go home at night,
Mhm.
every day is a pretty huge shift, and this idea that trying to be a productive member of a family when you can't even talk about what you did that day struck me as a pretty high hurdle to overcome, and I was interested in that. So I had this interest, and then at the same time, um, I had an outstanding commission
Mhm.
um, from a theater in Connecticut, and but they actually wanted a three-person play, but I was like, I only saw this as a one-person play, which is pretty ironic considering the opera.
Right.
But I couldn't quite figure it out for three people. And the one-person idea kept attracting. Almost like ideas to a magnet is kind of how I think of it. Sometimes when I get enough of them, I can get going. And so I wrote the one person play, hoping that maybe they would be interested in it. But they stuck to their guns and said they wanted the three-person play. So I wrote them another one,
Mhm.
and then Grounded kind of went back to myself, um, and I could do whatever I wanted with it, which worked out well for it.
And so, what was the research process like for taking on a topic that is obviously sort of politically charged, but also has these sort of technical components in terms of what it's actually like to operate a drone? So, what is the interview or research reading process like when you have an idea and then realize, oh, there's some detail that needs to be filled in? Because that sounds
Right.
very intimidating, at least to me.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think particularly because it was top secret, it was intimidating. It
Mhm.
was a bit challenging. I kind of would find little pieces of things here and there. What ended up being the most helpful was actually the Stars and Stripes magazine, which is an in-house military magazine, had an online feature that the public could read, and that was kind of where I found a lot of the psychological bent of the work. I think, as the military grows more accustomed to PTSD and is more comfortable with that as a term, I think they're trying to get ahead of that, and so I
Mhm.
think they were looking for it a little more than usual, and were surprised when they found it amongst the drone pilots. So that was definitely just a few articles on Stars and Stripes. I remember I highlight almost the entire, article. There was so much information in it. Other than that, it was really tricky in the beginning. It was hard to find out what the inside of the trailer looked like,
Right.
where they steer them. It was hard to see like how many screens do they have, how many throttles do they have. One of weirdly, one of the first color pictures I had of one of those was in this kind of strange children's book that I
Okay.
found in the Cleveland Library, that was like kind of for young boys and talking about how great drones were. And that
Mhm.
actually had this color picture, which was kind of crazy because I could not at the time find anything on the internet about it. Um, so yeah, it kind of came in drips and drabs. And I wrote the first draft, not no, there were some blanks to be filled in, but um, my thinking at the time was, well, okay, if this is being kept from us, if we're going to call this top secret, then all I can do is make it up. And if somebody wants to correct me somewhere down the line, they can. So that was kind of my philosophy. And over time, I did make some changes, as this became a little more common knowledge. And then at one point, after writing, I don't know if I was on the third or fourth draft, but I had a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force who worked with drones vet the script and read it. And that was a great conversation. I remember I was terrified to hear what he thought, worried that I was going to be completely off base. But he was very, very helpful. And he had worked in the theater himself in high school. He told me he was a stage manager. So he's like, I get how the theater works. And then he knew, he's like, okay, dramatic license, you're probably not going to want to change this, but this really should be this. And so he really gave a detailed analysis of the whole thing. And there were a few terms that I was using that weren't correct and that sort of thing. But overall, happily, it didn't require a complete overhaul.
Yeah. Do you remember some of the changes you made after you spoke with him?
I mean, the one that sticks with me was I think I thought that they could hover the drones, kind of like a helicopter, but they actually can't. So they have to keep circling. But they do stay looking at something, but they have to do it while moving. So he called that orbiting. And so that was one big change, but in the technical side, but it, as with most things, if you don't, I don't know, if you're open to change and open to new ideas, like the concept of orbiting became something that kind of, particularly almost more in the play, there's one time where she can't go home, and so she's circling her home on her car. And, so that kind of is a recurring element in both the play and the opera. So sometimes, as much as, you want to be 100% correct with your research, sometimes the corrections are fortuitous as well.
I also wonder if your experience as an actor shaped Grounded, because it's a one-person play, a monologue. Does your experience on the stage inform how you wrote that particular play?
I think so. I think it actually informs everything I write. I think, which is nice because it wasn't wasted time.
Yeah.
I feel that I kind of wait until I feel like I could act it. And then I kind of like, okay, now it's ready to go out there, anything that I write. And as you're saying, with the play, it was, because you're just getting deep inside this one person's head, and there's no other narrator. There's no other, you're getting everything from her. It was a challenge, but also I think made it a little easier to write that first draft. Because normally you've got to, if you've got 5 characters, you've got to keep hopping mentally from one. If you're doing dialogue between all 5, you've got to keep hopping between those 5 brains and try to give them all their due. And so it is easier in that sense, if that's the right word, to write a one-person play where it's really this one character's thoughts and opinions, and over time, not so much, not even your own necessarily as the writer.
So it's funny that you said it's easier to do one-person play rather than multiple characters, and then you end up having to do the adaptation and fleshing out or creating the characters who are mentioned by name in the play: Eric, Commander, Censor.
Right.
What is it like to create characters that you've invented already and put on the page, but are not voiced, or at least are not voiced by themselves? They're kind of ventriloquized through Jess at some point, who even in the play is not Jess, it's just the pilot.
Right.
So how do you go back? I don't know if that's going back to square one, but to sort of revivify these characters that are on the page but are not fully fleshed out, and to give them perspective and voice and all the things that a full character needs.
That was the big challenge, I would say, is that even though there are the other characters in the play, we're still getting them filtered through Jess. So it was like, okay, now we've got this opera where, as you say, the people are fully themselves. They're not Jess's version of them. They are them. So particularly her husband, needed to be, as full a character as we could accomplish. and he changed quite a bit. I mean, in the play, he runs a hardware store. He's kind of a more everyman, and then in the opera, we had a feeling that he should be somebody bigger, somebody more mythic, to kind of meet her, and that somebody of the earth, this rancher kind of made sense elementally with our pilot up in the sky. Yeah, so I know, I mean, writing his arias were challenging, to kind of find out, okay, because he was even a step away from the Eric in the play because he was a rancher now. So then I had to do all kind of research into that.
More research,
more research, different research. At least it wasn't about war, but and it was really interesting because that was a world I didn't know at all. So yeah, just got to kind of get into his head and get into how ranching works and what matters to these guys and gals out there who work the land, and yeah, so there, I mean, and there's a lot that ended up on the cutting room floor too. Ultimately, it's Jess's story, and that was also the tricky part is keeping it focused on her, but allowing the people around her to exist on their own, but it still has to be her story, or else it gets a little wonky. But I'm happy with. I know Janine was really trying to get Eric into one of the scenes in Act 2 where they're all kind of going about their routines, and I don't believe he was in the previous version that we did in DC. I don't think we figured out quite how to get him in there, but I was really happy with how that turned out this go round. That he's kind of in the same boat she is, where he's working this job that he doesn't really want to be there at all, and there's something very rote to it, and for him, who's a good gambler, it's a pretty simple task of the being a blackjack dealer. Yeah, so he had his own little tragedy. I know I wrote an aria for the commander as well that never quite made it. But it was helpful for us to get an idea of who he was and a little more about him and how he felt about Jess and that relationship. Yeah, so there's kind of no wasted work. Either you get to know the character more, or the singer singing them gets to know them more. Even if something gets cut, they had it once and it's in their bones.
I also wonder how you approach the form of the libretto, which is this weird thing. And we talked with Paul Cremo last week about, like, is it a play? Is it poetry? It's kind of one, it's kind of the other. And I'm wondering what was the most surprising and or challenging thing about going from a play, which is Ground is a pretty short play, to this thing called the libretto, which is kind of amorphous. And what did you learn about the play or the form of the libretto in that process?
Yeah, I will say I was startled when Paul at one point sent me word counts of some of the famous operas, and that I was like, oh my God, because as you say, the play is short, and I kind of assumed, well, we'll just do the play. And then got that email and I was like, oh my God, we're already over. Like, I'm already over. And I haven't started. So that was a sobering moment, for sure. And then, I guess, I mean, one thing Janine responded to in the play was this feeling. She's like, there's space there. There's space for music. And, as it's written on the page, it is a kind of, I don't know, somewhere, as you say, between play and poem. And so there is a lot of literal white space around the words. And there is, for the actors who've done the play, there's such a freedom of, like, there's no stage directions really. I mean, it's kind of up to them and the director, what pace they want to take and what each line means, and as it heads to the next one. So I know that Janine responded to that kind of that there was room for music, in there. So that was encouraging. And Paul sent me a lot of new operas.
Mhm.
So I got to look at them, and yeah, I think I was maybe hoping that there would be something a little more consistent, but really, there's so many different ways to skin this particular cat, and but that was in itself kind of encouraging. I was like, okay, well, all these people took different ways to get there, so there's not a form I need to follow, or and just kind of finding and feeling my way through it. I feel like the play I felt always had a strong rhythm to it.
Mhm.
It doesn't have music, but it does have. I think when an actor keys into with the pulse of it, um, uh, is when those are strong performances. And so I knew the play had that, but I knew that it would probably be different than the rhythm, that Janine would come up with. So in some ways that was helpful, and others not. But yeah, and then just finding out. I mean, as we did, which um, favorite lines of either mine or Janine's, that some of them you all may have noticed, like, moved from, one scene to the end, or,
Mhm.
I mean, we kind of preserved what we desire to, but not necessarily where it is located in the play. Things moved around quite a bit, and reshuffled, but it was a fun, and certainly it was a challenge.
So now that you've finished Grounded, you are working on a new libretto for an opera that's been commissioned by the Met about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We heard Paul
Mhm,
Cremo describe this briefly last week by composer Maxim Kolomiets.
mhm,
Can you tell us a little bit about? You don't have to give away too much about the story, although Paul gave us a bit of a synopsis,
mhm,
but how the experience of doing Grounded informs what you're doing now for this new project, especially since it's in some ways it's similar. It's a
mhm,
politically charged contemporary topic. On the other hand, it does not have this libretto, to my knowledge, does not have a source, written by you or somebody else.
mhm, mhm.
So it's not an adaptation.
Correct.
So
Yes.
how are you going about this process, however far along it is? And what are the lessons learned from Grounded,
Mhm.
if any, to help that process along?
Yeah, as you say, yeah, this was an original story, so it was
Right.
a different beast, and that was exciting. I will say, after having lived with Grounded for over 10 years,
Mhm.
to be able to start from scratch, and with the having gone through this experience, and to know a little more about what's possible and what's encouraged, and what's um, the kind of variety that is desired, in opera, as far as, an aria and a duet, and, a choral number. And I mean, luckily, the Met offers such freedom. I mean, in some ways, I mean, if you want to have a character come on for one scene and then go away, that's possible.
Mhm.
Whereas, in the theater world, you would never be able to afford that, and that character would be probably cut. But yeah, so that was very exciting. And I think, partly because of the subject matter, which, I gave a lot of thought to trying to figure out what, this is such this is a moving vehicle right now, this
Mhm.
conflict, and trying to figure out, like, what will, by the time an opera gets done, 3-4 years down the line, what will we still care about, or what, it can't really be about, like, the here and now, because the here and now is going to be very different tomorrow, and
Right.
so on. So trying to find a subject matter um, that I felt like, Americans would be interested in, since this will be, here at the Met, and be something that is a little more universal, or um, along those lines. So, so reading about this um, fact that these children are being taken, and by various means, into Russia, and from their parents, was something that I felt like everybody has a pretty, visceral reaction to that. And I think it's pretty clear that it's not a good practice, hopefully. So once I hit upon that, I because in reality, most of the people who have gone to get these kids have been women. They've mostly been their mothers, their sisters, their grandmothers, partly because the men are all off fighting. So I knew that would probably be the makeup of the cast and such. And it was exciting to I felt kind of weird with Grounded, since it started out as a one-woman play, and so featured it was 100% female cast, and then went to the opera where you've got 50 guys up there and two women, three women with Lucy, the daughter, so this maybe in some ways is a little corrective to that, or balancing the scales a little bit with kind of three female leads, and then really, I mean, there aren't too many men in it. Partly, as I said, for that reason, that the men are mostly away in the combat, and it is up to these women left behind to make this rescue.
Awesome. Well, we're very much looking forward to it. We hope it's sooner rather than later.
Yes.
It's a long process. And thank you so much again for joining us, and for making Grounded, which so many students saw and loved.
Oh, fabulous.
And we'll be waiting with bated breath for the next one.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks everybody out there.